March 31, 1944. The Pacific sky split open with lightning. Admiral Minichi Koga's massive Kawanishi H-8K Emily flying boat fought the storm above the Philippine Sea, rain hammering against its wings like bullets. Inside sat Japan's most powerful naval mind, the man chosen to carry Yamamoto's legacy after his death the previous year. In Koga's briefcase were documents so secret that even senior officers hadn't seen them. The Z Plan, Japan's grand design to defend its empire and crush the American advance. It was supposed to be the blueprint that would turn the tide of war. But as thunder rolled and the plane pitched violently, fate intervened. At 10:15 p.m., a bolt of lightning struck the starboard engine. The aircraft banked sharply, then vanished into the black water below. For days, no one in Tokyo knew what had happened. The admiral's disappearance was treated like a state secret. Patrol planes combed the islands of the Philippines, but it wasn't imperial rescue teams who found the wreckage. It was Filipino guerrillas, fighters loyal to the resistance against Japan. Scattered among the debris, they discovered a sealed metal case. When opened, they saw maps, orders, and coded messages, documents marked with Japan's naval seal. They smuggled the find through jungle trails to American intelligence on Leyte. Within weeks, the contents reached Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. When U.S. analysts realized what they held, they were stunned. The entire Pacific defense network of the empire, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, lay exposed. The Z Plan didn't just predict Japan's moves, it revealed how deeply they misunderstood their enemy. A single storm had done what no fleet could. It drowned Japan's greatest admiral and handed America the keys to destroy an empire. Before the storm that swallowed Admiral Koga, Japan's faith in its Pacific defenses was absolute. From Tarawa to Truk, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, the empire had transformed coral and sand into concrete citadels. Engineers worked under tropical suns to pour bunkers, dig tunnels, and mount anti-aircraft guns into the bones of the islands themselves. To Koga and his war council, this was more than strategy. It was religion. They called it Ketsugo, the doctrine of decisive battle. The plan was simple: draw the Americans into fortified traps, bleed them dry through attrition, and crush their morale with one great counterblow from the combined fleet. It was the same dream that had fueled Japan since Tsushima in 1905. The belief that spiritual will and sacrifice could overcome industrial might. The Z Plan was meant to turn that belief into a reality. Each island was a gear in the great machine of the Pacific fortress system. Jaluit, Mili, Wotja, and Kwajalein were all transformed into heavily armed bastions. Airstrips bristled with Zero fighters. Artillery covered every beach, and underground shelters snaked beneath the coral. Japan believed that when the Americans came, they would do as they had at Tarawa: charge headlong into hell and pay in blood for every inch. It wasn't arrogance, it was a doctrine built on history. But the truth Koga couldn't see from his command desk was that history was about to betray him. When the captured Z Plan reached Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz studied it for days. He saw not an unbreakable wall, but a pattern, a chain of strongholds so predictable that it could be bypassed entirely. The Japanese had concentrated their strength where it mattered least, at the edges. The interior, the command hubs, the logistics points, the arteries of supply were astonishingly weak. Among them was Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative heart of the Marshall Islands. Out of more than 5,000 Japanese personnel stationed there, barely a fifth were trained for combat. The rest were clerks, engineers, and Korean laborers. At the time, the Japanese High Command still believed the Americans lacked imagination, that they would attack methodically, island by island, bleeding for each coral strip just as they had at Tarawa. Koga had died still convinced of that, but Nimitz was about to prove that the true power of the U.S. Navy wasn't just in its battleships, it was in its brains. He looked at the red circles on his map marking Jaluit and Mila, then tapped his finger on Kwajalein instead. "We're not going to their strength," he said. "We're going to their heart." That single decision would erase decades of Japanese doctrine in less than a week. The empire of fortresses had built its walls high, but Nimitz had found the door no one knew existed. At Pearl Harbor in January 1944, 1944, a small group of senior officers gathered in the map room aboard the flagship Enterprise. The walls were lined with charts of the Marshall Islands, each island circled in red grease pencil. Jaluit, Mila, Maluelap. To the Japanese, these names represented an iron wall, the outposts that would grind down any invasion. For weeks, reconnaissance photos had poured in showing rows of coastal guns, thick concrete bunkers, and airstrips packed with Zero fighters. The consensus among most of Nimitz's staff was clear: hit them in order, like stepping stones. But Nimitz sat quietly, studying the map as if it were a chessboard. Then he said the words that froze the room. "We skip the outer islands. We go straight for Kwajalein." To some, it sounded reckless, even suicidal. Skipping the outer defenses went against decades of military logic. But Nimitz had something the Japanese didn't: their playbook. The Z plan revealed not only Japan's defenses, but its expectations. The entire strategy relied on the Americans behaving predictably, attacking strength first. If the U.S. Navy broke that rhythm, the whole system would collapse. Nimitz wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting to destroy the Japanese way of thinking. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, deception became the Americans' most powerful weapon. Carrier task forces bombed Jaluit, Mila, and Maluelap relentlessly, drawing Japan's attention toward the very islands Nimitz intended to ignore. Pilots risked their lives in these diversionary raids, knowing the goal wasn't victory, but misdirection. To Tokyo, it looked exactly like Tarawa all over again: slow, methodical, and bloody. They never realized that the true blow was coming for Kwajalein, the nerve center of the Marshalls. Nimitz's gamble was radical, but it was also brutally efficient. Why storm a fortress when you could turn it into a prison? Every bypassed garrison would wither without supplies, cut off by sea and air. It wasn't about meeting the enemy head-on, it was about rendering him irrelevant. For Japan, it was the beginning of a nightmare, a war where courage no longer mattered, and strategy, not sacrifice, decided survival. At dawn on January 29, 1944, the horizon over the Pacific shimmered with steel. Battleships, carriers, and transports stretched farther than the eye could see. More than 40,000 men bound for the Marshalls. It was called Operation Flintlock, and it would become the proof of Nimitz's genius. The fleet was led by Vice Admiral Richmond Turner and Rear Admiral Harry Hill, commanding an invasion force unlike anything Japan had faced before. 7 battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and landing ships formed a floating city of war. The 4th Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division stood ready in their transports, silent under the weight of what they were about to do. They weren't attacking an outpost. They were going straight for the Empire's heart, Kwajalein Atoll. For days, the Armada steamed through heavy seas, undetected by Japanese patrols. Then, on January 30th, the silence broke. Battleships thundered to life, their 14-inch guns vomiting fire across the lagoon. The bombardment was relentless, an entire island chain erased beneath geysers of smoke and debris. For 72 hours, American shells and carrier aircraft reduced Japanese positions to rubble. Pilots flying over the atoll described it as a churning gray sea where the land used to be. The plan was to annihilate every possible defense before the troops even hit the sand. Inside the bunkers, Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, the Japanese commander of the Marshalls, listened in disbelief as the reports came in. He had assured his superiors that the Americans would never strike Kwajalein directly, that they would batter the outer atolls first, bleeding themselves dry. But now, the enemy's shells were landing right on his command post. Akiyama's staff scrambled to restore communications as radio lines went dead one by one. Ammunition stores exploded. Aircraft burned in their revetments. Within 24 hours, 92 of the Marshall's 110 planes were gone. The once mighty fortress had no air cover left. Nimitz's gamble had worked. While Japan's coastal guns waited for an invasion that would never come, the real blow was falling from within. The Americans hadn't just outfought their enemy, they had outthought him. And as the first wave of landing craft began forming offshore, the age of fortress warfare was about to die on the beaches of Kwajalein. January 31st, 1944. The Pacific dawn broke red. Across the churning lagoon of Kwajalein, hundreds of American landing craft bobbed in formation. Battleships opened fire once more, pounding the beaches in a coordinated fury. The thunder of naval guns rolled over the waves like a living storm. 7,000 tons of shells in a single morning. Dust and flame cloaked the horizon. The Marines of the 4th Division and the soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division gripped their rifles and waited for the order to move. Then came the signal, "Land the troops." As the first waves advanced, naval gunners shifted fire inland, laying down a curtain of steel. The landing craft slammed onto the beaches of Kwajalein Island, and men poured out into a wasteland of smoke, coral, and shattered concrete. Trees were shredded into toothpicks. The air stank of gunpowder and burning oil. The Americans had expected heavy fire, machine guns, mortars, sniper nests. Instead, the resistance was scattered, stunned by days of bombardment. The defenders who survived fought with fanatical courage, emerging from craters and pillboxes to launch suicide charges that ended in flashes of fire. Behind the front lines, engineers worked under relentless fire to clear mines, blow gaps through seawalls, and mark safe paths for tanks. The M4 Shermans clattered ashore, their tracks chewing through sand and debris. Machine gun fire pinged harmlessly off their armor as they crushed bunkers and turned the battlefield into ruin. By nightfall, half of Kwajalein was in American hands. The rest was a charred graveyard, the remains of Japan's most fortified island, reduced to rubble. Admiral Akiyama's command post was in chaos. His radios were silent, his airfields gone, and his troops either dead or cut off. He scribbled one final note in his journal before the walls caved in. "Our doctrine has failed. The enemy fights without honor, without pattern." Those words would be found later by American intelligence officers, a haunting confession that Japan's strategy had collapsed. The empire's strongest fortress was being devoured, not by courage, but by flexibility. By the dawn of February 1st, 1944, the beaches of Kwajalein were littered with wreckage, twisted helmets, shattered rifles, and the blackened remains of bunkers that had once symbolized Japan's pride. The sound of machine gun bursts echoed across the atoll as American units pushed inland, house by house, crater by crater. The defenders had nowhere to go. Their communications were gone, their supplies destroyed, and their morale obliterated. Some fought to the death, clutching grenades to their chests. Others simply vanished beneath the ruins, buried alive by naval shells. What was meant to be Japan's wall against invasion had become its tomb. To the north, the 4th Marine Division stormed the twin islands of Roy and Namur, facing the most desperate resistance yet. The Japanese had transformed the area into a network of hidden bunkers and explosive traps. As the Marines advanced, a massive ammunition dump detonated, killing over 20 men in an instant and leveling an entire block. The shockwave sent debris hundreds of feet into the air. Survivors described it as the sun exploding in front of us. Yet even that horror didn't stop the assault. Within 48 hours, the Marines had captured both islands at a terrible cost, but the Japanese garrison of more than 3,500 men had been completely annihilated. By February 2nd, the battle was over. Rear Admiral Akiyama was dead, his staff wiped out, and the last pockets of Japanese soldiers had either been killed or committed suicide. Nearly 11,000 defenders were gone in 4 days. American losses were a fraction, fewer than 400 killed and around 1,000 wounded. The ratio was staggering, almost unthinkable compared to Tarawa just months before, where 1,000 Marines had died for a single strip of coral. When Nimitz received the casualty report, he didn't celebrate. He studied them in silence and said, "This is how we move forward. Never fight the enemy's war. Make him fight yours." To him, Kwajalein wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation. Japan's entire Pacific strategy, its centuries-old faith in courage over calculation, had been shattered. Every island fortress that once stood as a symbol of strength now stood as a warning. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. In modern warfare, brains would always defeat bravado. For Japan, the cost of learning that truth was 11,000 dead men, 4 lost islands, and the death of an empire's illusion. The fortresses hadn't fallen because their soldiers lacked courage. They fell because courage alone no longer won wars. When the guns finally fell silent over Kwajalein Lagoon, the survivors on both sides faced the haunting aftermath. The beaches, once white coral, had turned black with ash and oil. Smoke drifted lazily over the water as American engineers picked through the rubble, clearing mines and counting bodies. What they found stunned them. Entire Japanese units still in firing positions, weapons in hand, each soldier shot or burned where he stood. Few had surrendered. Out of nearly 11,000 defenders, only a few hundred were taken prisoner, most of them wounded or unconscious. It was slaughter born from doctrine. Japan's commanders had demanded death before surrender, and their men had obeyed. For those left alive, the scale of devastation was incomprehensible. Marines who had fought at Tarawa couldn't believe how quickly the battle had ended. It felt like fighting ghosts, one sergeant said. They were brave, but broken before we even landed. As medics carried away the wounded, others began burying the dead under the blistering Pacific sun. The heat was unbearable. The stench of smoke, decay, and seawater clung to their clothes for days. Every trench became a mass grave, each mound marked by simple wooden crosses. Meanwhile, across the remaining Marshall Islands, Jaluit, Mili, Votia, and Maloelap, nearly 10,000 Japanese troops still manned their posts, waiting for an attack that would never come. Nimitz had no intention of wasting men storming those islands. Instead, he cut them off completely. Supply ships stopped arriving. Communications went dark. The once proud garrisons were left to starve and rot in isolation, surrounded by endless ocean. Over the next year, disease and hunger claimed them by the thousands. To the Japanese high command, the reports from Kwajalein were almost impossible to accept. Fortress warfare, the very soul of imperial strategy, had failed utterly. The soldiers who had been told they were the steel wall of the Pacific had vanished in less than 100 hours. One general reportedly whispered, "We built fortresses, but the enemy built ghosts." For the Americans, Kwajalein was proof of a new kind of war, a war of movement, deception, and overwhelming precision. The age of courage was over. The age of calculation had begun. In the weeks after Kwajalein fell, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the Marshall Islands. In Tokyo, Japan's naval staff pored over intercepted radio reports and intelligence summaries, refusing at first to believe what they read. How could an island they had fortified for years, ringed with bunkers, anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of troops, fall in just 4 days? How could the decisive battle strategy, inherited from Admiral Yamamoto himself, collapse so completely? But as survivor testimonies reached the mainland, one truth became undeniable. Japan's concept of war was dead. For decades, the Imperial Navy had worshipped the idea of the decisive clash, a single glorious confrontation that would destroy the enemy and restore honor to the empire. It worked in 1905 at Tsushima against the Russians, and they believed it would work again. But World War II was a different kind of conflict. The Americans didn't play by those rules. Instead of clashing head-on, they bypassed strongholds, cut off supply lines, and turned Japan's strength into weakness. Every island fortress became a trap, not for the Americans, but for the Japanese soldiers ordered to defend them. After Kwajalein, Nimitz and his commanders refined this new doctrine. It would be called island hopping, a strategy of precision, not attrition. The U.S. would leapfrog past heavy defenses, seize airfields, and isolate enemy garrisons until they starved. The next targets were already chosen: Eniwetok, Saipan, and later Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each would follow the same cold formula: hit fast, hit hard, move on. Japan's armies, spread thin and blind to the new reality, could only react too late. For the men who had fought at Kwajalein, it was proof that intelligence had triumphed over ideology. A single captured plan, the Zed Plan, had rewritten the course of the Pacific War. For Japan, it was humiliation made visible in ruins. Rear Admiral Akiyama's body, recovered from a collapsed bunker, became a grim symbol of the empire's fading myth that bravery could overcome firepower. When the news reached Washington, Roosevelt sent a single-line message to Nimitz: "Well done. 1. Keep moving forward. The age of fortresses was over. The age of maneuver and total war had begun. By February 4th, 1944, the smoke over Kwajalein Lagoon had thinned, but the echoes of battle still drifted across the water. American engineers raised the stars and stripes over the shattered island, marking the first major stepping stone toward Japan's inner ring of defense. Reporters back home called it the fastest victory in Pacific history. But for those who had fought there, it was more than a victory. It was a message carved in blood and fire. Japan's empire was no longer untouchable. Within months, Nimitz's fleet struck again. Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, each one a leap closer to Tokyo. From the captured airfields, B-29 superfortresses took off to bomb Japan's home islands directly, turning the war into a siege. Every success traced back to the revelation at Kwajalein that intelligence, adaptability, and mobility could dismantle even the mightiest empire. The Americans had learned to skip battles that didn't matter, to starve garrisons instead of storming them, and to use time as a weapon. For Japan, the psychological collapse was worse than the physical loss. The Bushido spirit, the belief that honor and sacrifice could outmatch material power, had cracked. Officers raised in that tradition were left staring at a world that no longer played by their code. Their fortresses had not fallen to cowardice or retreat, but to an enemy who refused to fight by their rules. In private diaries, Japanese officers described the feeling as fighting shadows. When historians look back, Kwajalein stands as the battle that buried the old way of war. It proved that modern conflict belonged to those who could adapt, not those who could endure. The cost for Japan was staggering. Over 11,000 dead in just 4 days. For America, fewer than 400 killed. The clearest proof yet that precision and planning could save lives where brute force could not. Standing amid the ruins, a Marine officer wrote home, "We didn't just take an island. We changed the way wars will be fought forever." And he was right. Kwajalein was not just a triumph of arms. It was the moment the Pacific turned, and Japan's empire began to die.